The alien queen's daughter introduced me as her husband. The entire royal party froze. Thomas had been told, in the kind of briefing voice usually reserved for warning someone about live electrical wiring, that the Velrathi reception hall measured its formality in micro-gestures. The angle of a bow. The half-second a guest was permitted to hold eye contact with a royal before it became a diplomatic incident. The exact number of steps between the entrance arch and the receiving line, which apparently had been calculated centuries ago by a court mathematician who clearly had nothing better to do, and which nobody had bothered to recalculate since, even after the floor was replaced. He counted the steps anyway, because counting things was what he did when his hands wanted to shake and his brain needed somewhere safe to put itself. 14. 14 steps from the arch to where the Velrathi nobility stood arranged like an extremely expensive choir, robes the color of deep water and stormlight, every one of them with those long, elegant ears that tapered to a point, and that Thomas had spent an embarrassing number of hours trying not to stare at during his first month on the planet. He'd gotten better at it, mostly. The human delegation was small, 11 people, counting the ambassador, counting Thomas, who was technically a cultural liaison and unofficially the guy who fixed the universal translators when they started insisting that "thank you" meant "your grandmother's bones." And they stood near the back of the hall in suits that had clearly been tailored by someone who had only ever seen a photograph of a human suit. Thomas's collar itched. He resisted the urge to scratch it on the grounds that scratching might in this room be a declaration of war. "You're doing the thing," said Captain Reyes beside him, not looking over, smiling at the room the way diplomats smiled, with the lower half of the face only. "What thing?" "The thing where you go somewhere else in your head, and your face stays here as a decoy." "I'm fully present," Thomas said. "I am 100% here in this hall, surrounded by several hundred extremely tall people who could probably end my career by frowning at me wrong." "But they could end your career by frowning at you wrong regardless of where your head is. Might as well enjoy the frown." Thomas did not find this comforting, but he appreciated the attempt. The way you appreciate someone trying to hand you a parachute mid-fall, even though you both know it's made of paper. The receiving line had been moving for the better part of 40 minutes, a long, unhurried river of introductions, each name spoken in the high Velrathi cadence that made even the most mundane title sound like the opening line of an epic poem. Minister of Atmospheric Trade became something closer to he who negotiates the breath between worlds, which Thomas privately thought was a tremendous upgrade, and had suggested, half-joking, that Earth adopt similarly inflated titles. Captain Reyes had pointed out that he who files the quarterly reports lacked a certain majesty. Thomas had conceded the point. Queen Vivian stood at the head of the line in robes the color of a sky about to do something dramatic, her ears adorned with thin bands of metal that caught the light each time she turned her head, which she did slowly, deliberately, like a woman who had long ago run out of patience for sudden movement, and had simply decided to remove it from her vocabulary entirely. Beside her stood Princess Mila, and Thomas had learned over the 8 months of the Joint Research Initiative that Mila's stillness was a different species of stillness than her mother's. Not patience worn smooth by decades of court, but the coiled quiet of someone who found the entire performance mildly absurd and was simply choosing, for now, not to say so out loud. He had also learned, somewhere in those 8 months, in the long hours in the atmospheric labs where the translators kept glitching, and they'd ended up just talking instead, in slow, imperfect sentences, that her laugh started in her shoulders before it ever reached her face, that she organized her research notes by emotional reaction to the data rather than chronology, a system that made no sense to anyone except her, and that he had, against every instinct of his organized human brain, found himself adopting. That she asked questions like she was opening doors she expected to find empty rooms behind, and was delighted every single time there was actually something there. He had not learned, apparently, what she might do with a receiving line full of 400 dignitaries and a complete disregard for the established order of diplomatic disclosure. The line moved forward. Introductions happened. A trade minister was introduced to the Queen with the kind of bow that took 11 seconds, which Thomas timed out of nervous habit and found, with the small petty satisfaction of a man counting steps, deeply unnecessary. Somewhere to his left, one of the junior attachés whispered to another that the 11-second bow was reserved for ministers of rank 7 or above. And the other attaché whispered back something about how rank 6 had been trying to get an upgrade for years, and everyone knew it. And Thomas filed this away as exactly the kind of office politics that apparently existed on every inhabited world in the galaxy, which he found, in a strange way, comforting. Some things, it seemed, were universal, petty grievances about seating charts, the quiet superiority of whoever got the better bow. Then it was the delegation's turn, and Thomas's stomach performed a maneuver that no atmospheric trade minister, however many syllables in his title, could have negotiated a treaty for. Ambassador Chen went first, smooth and practiced, the standard greeting delivered in flawless high Velrathi that had taken her 2 years of evening classes, and by her own admission, several truly humiliating misunderstandings involving the word for honored and the word for marinated. Captain Reyes followed, then 2 of the science attachés, and then it was Thomas's turn to step forward those final 14 steps, fully expecting the same. A name, a title, a bow calibrated to exactly the correct number of seconds for a cultural liaison of his particular rank, which he privately suspected was somewhere around rank 2, possibly rank 1.5 on a good day. Princess Mila looked at him. Something in her expression shifted, light catching the point of one ear as she tilted her head, and Thomas had just enough time to think, with the specific dread of a man who has spent 8 months learning to read a particular face. Oh no. I know that look, before she opened her mouth in front of the entire assembled Velrathi court, and said, in a voice pitched for the whole hall to hear, with no apparent awareness whatsoever that she was about to detonate something. This is Thomas, my husband. The receiving line did not so much stop as cease to exist as a moving entity. 400 years of court protocol arriving at a wall it had no established phrase for, and simply standing in front of it, blinking. Somewhere behind him, Thomas heard Captain Reyes make a small sound that was not quite a cough. Queen Vivian turned her head, slowly, deliberately. The metal bands in her ears caught the light, and for one long, suspended moment, the most powerful woman on Velrath Prime looked at her daughter with an expression that contained, in rapid and silent sequence, shock, recalculation. The dawning understanding that this had clearly already happened weeks ago without her, and something underneath all of it that Thomas, who had spent 8 months learning to read one particular Velrathi face, and was now, with mounting horror, forced to extend that skill to a second one in real time, could only describe as a mother recognizing, too late, that the time for having an opinion about this had already passed. No one moved. Thomas had read once, in some half-remembered physics elective, that a system in perfect equilibrium could remain frozen indefinitely until some outside force nudged it, and he understood now, standing in the wreckage of 400 years of receiving line protocol, that he was apparently that outside force, a man-shaped disturbance in an otherwise orderly universe, and that the universe was currently deciding what to do about him. It was the Queen's chief steward who broke first, a tall, silver-eared man named Aldrich whose entire professional existence, as far as Thomas could tell, revolved around making sure ceremonies proceeded exactly as written. He took one step forward, opened his mouth, looked at the Queen, looked at the princess, looked at Thomas with the particular despair of a man whose carefully laminated procedure cards had just become decorative, and said, in a voice that cracked slightly in the middle, "Shall I the line should the line continue, your majesty, or—" "The line," said Queen Vivian, in a tone Thomas could only describe as glacial in the geological sense. vast and slow-moving and capable of reshaping a continent over several thousand years. We'll wait. But Mila, for her part, looked entirely unbothered, which somehow made everything worse. She had the expression of someone who had said something true and obvious. The sky is up there, water is wet, Thomas is my husband, and was mildly puzzled that anyone found it noteworthy. Thomas had seen this expression before, usually right before she explained some piece of Velrathi atmospheric chemistry that he did not understand, and that she could not fathom anyone not understanding. "Mother," she said, "you're doing the face." "I am not doing a face. You're doing the face where your left ear drops a half degree, and you think no one notices." Several nobles near the front of the line had gone very still in the specific way that people go still when they are trying extremely hard to memorize every detail of an event for later retelling. Thomas could feel 400 pairs of eyes on him with the precise weight of 400 pairs of eyes, which was, it turned out, a measurable and significant weight, and he became abruptly and acutely aware that his collar had chosen this exact moment to itch again, and that scratching it now would almost certainly be interpreted as some kind of formal challenge. "Perhaps," Ambassador Chen said, materializing at Thomas's elbow with the smooth, practiced calm of a woman who had spent a career walking into rooms after they'd already caught fire, "this might be a conversation better suited to a smaller setting." "An excellent suggestion," the Queen said, not looking at the ambassador at all, her attention fixed entirely on her daughter with an intensity that made the air feel several degrees warmer. "The East receiving chamber. Now." Now, Aldrich clarified, to no one, mostly to himself, already reaching for the small communication disc at his collar to begin the logistics of redirecting 400 dignitaries' worth of ceremonial momentum. "Yes, now is, I'll see to the canapés being moved." "Forget the canapés, Aldrich." "The canapés cannot simply be forgotten, Your Majesty. They are temperature sensitive." Thomas found, somewhere in the part of his brain that had not yet caught fire with panic, a small flicker of gratitude for Aldrich, a man clearly determined to hold onto some scrap of normal procedure, even as the ceremonial fabric of the evening tore itself apart around him. Some things, Thomas thought again, really were universal. Somewhere on Earth right now, some equally beleaguered event coordinator was having an identical crisis about shrimp. They moved as a strange, awkward procession through a side archway. The Queen first, spine straight as a drawn bowstring, then Mila, walking with the unhurried ease of someone who had detonated a diplomatic incident and intended to enjoy the aftermath. Then Thomas, then the ambassador, then Captain Reyes, who leaned in close enough to murmur, "I would like it on record that I warned you about the going somewhere else in your head thing, and that this is exactly the kind of moment it would have been useful to actually be present for." "I was present," Thomas hissed back. "I just didn't know I was getting married 8 months ago." "You did know you were getting married 8 months ago. That's rather the point." Thomas opened his mouth to argue this, found he had no actual argument, and closed it again. The East Chamber was smaller, paneled in some pale wood analog that grew in long, deliberate grain patterns Thomas had learned were cultivated rather than carved, grown into shape over years by gardeners who treated architecture the way Earth gardeners treated topiary. A single long window looked out over the lower terraces, where the twin moons of Velrath Prime, one the color of old brass, the other a faint, sickly green that always reminded Thomas of certain fluorescent hallway lighting back home, hung low over the gardens. The door sealed behind them with a soft pneumatic hush, and for a moment the four of them simply stood in the sudden, ringing quiet. "Explain," the Queen said. Just the one word, delivered with the weight of an entire legal proceeding folded inside it. "It's not complicated," Mila said. "We went to the registry office in Lower Havana, filled out the forms. There were 2 witnesses, a clerk with a wonderful sense of humor about the whole thing, and we got a small certificate that I have been meaning to show you, and then several things happened in quick succession involving the Tessari trade negotiations, and the timing never quite. The timing, the Queen repeated, never quite presented itself, Mila finished, with the serene confidence of a woman who knew she was on thin ice and had decided the best strategy was to simply continue walking forward on it at a normal pace. 8 months, the Queen said, of joint research briefings. 8 months in which I personally signed the authorization for this man's security clearance, in which I sat across from you at family dinner no fewer than 30 times, in which you discussed, extensively, the migratory patterns of Velrathi cloudials, and at no point did the words, "I have married the human cultural liaison" arise. The cloudials are fascinating, Mother. You wouldn't have wanted me to rush past them. Thomas, against every survival instinct currently screaming at him to remain silent and possibly invisible, felt a small, treacherous laugh try to climb up his throat, because there was something almost unbearably absurd about being scolded by a queen who was simultaneously failing to scold her own daughter for the actual offense, getting derailed instead onto eel migration. And he had to look very deliberately at the window and the sickly green moon until the urge passed. "Your Majesty," he said, when he trusted his voice again, "for what it's worth, I take full responsibility for the part where I should have insisted on a more, formally announced version of events. I just wanted on the record that I was significantly more terrified of you finding out than I was of marrying your daughter, which I think says something reasonably nice about your daughter if you squint." There was a pause. The Queen's left ear dropped, very slightly, the half-degree Mila had mentioned, and for one suspended second Thomas genuinely could not tell whether he had just made things infinitely worse or, by some miracle, slightly less catastrophic. "Squinting," the Queen said at last, "will not be necessary." It was not, Thomas would reflect later, the worst thing the Queen could have said, but it was also not quite the gracious acceptance he had allowed himself to hope for in the half-second after she said it. The silence that followed had a texture to it, dense and considering, the kind of silence that made a man suddenly very aware of his own breathing, of the small mechanical hum from the window ledge, where some kind of climate regulator was quietly correcting for the chill coming off the glass. "Sit," the Queen said finally, gesturing to a low arrangement of chairs near the window that had clearly not been designed with this conversation in mind, having been built, Thomas suspected, for far more pleasant occasions involving tea and considerably less ambient dread. "All of you. I find I do better thinking when I am not looming, and I am aware that I loom. It has been brought to my attention before." "By me," Mila said, settling into a chair with the easy grace of someone who had grown up in rooms like this and had long since stopped finding them intimidating. "Repeatedly, since I was 9. You were a very blunt child. I was an accurate child. There's a difference." Thomas lowered himself into the chair across from the Queen with the careful, deliberate motion of a man diffusing something, half expecting the furniture itself to object to his presence, but it held, and he allowed himself one slow breath that he hoped looked like composure rather than the small internal earthquake it actually was. Captain Reyes and the ambassador had remained near the door, doing the diplomatic equivalent of becoming furniture themselves, present but determinedly unobtrusive, occasionally exchanging a glance that Thomas recognized as the silent shorthand of two people who would absolutely be discussing this later over something considerably stronger than the ceremonial wine. "I want to understand something," the Queen said, addressing Thomas directly now, her eyes, a pale, storm-colored gray that Mila's were a warmer echo of, fixed on him with an attention that felt less like hostility and more like genuine, clinical curiosity, the look of a scientist encountering an unexpected result. "You are aware, presumably, of what this means. Politically, structurally. You did not simply marry a woman, cultural liaison. You married the heir to the Velrathi crown, and whatever quiet, unceremonious version of events occurred in a registry office in Lower Havana, the cosmos at large will not process it that way. The Tessari will not process it that way. My own court clearly did not process it gracefully, and they had several seconds of warning that I did not. I'm aware, Thomas said, in the abstract sense that keeps a person awake at 3 in the morning doing math about treaty implications. I will admit I had not fully wargamed the receiving line scenario specifically. That one snuck up on me. It snuck up on everyone, Mila said. That was rather the appeal. It was not an appeal. It was a strategy, the Queen said. And there was something in the way she said it, not quite approval, but the reluctant recognition of competence. The specific tone of a chess player watching an opponent make a move they hadn't seen coming and grudgingly respecting the audacity of it, that made Mila's mouth curve at one corner. You did not want a private conversation in which I might find reasons, careful diplomatic reasons, dressed in language about timing and optics, to suggest the marriage be quietly set aside before it became politically inconvenient. You wanted it announced in front of 400 witnesses so that unmaking it would require unmaking it publicly, which I would never do, because I am, whatever else I am, not a fool, and I understand precisely what that would cost the Crown's credibility. I prefer to think of it, Mila said, as efficient diplomacy. You ambushed your own coronation reception. It wasn't my coronation reception, it was a trade gala. You're being dramatic. I am allowed to be dramatic. I am the Queen. It is in the job description, along with the robes and the extremely impractical ear cuffs that I am told symbolize the unbroken chain of matriarchal succession, and that in practice mostly just catch on door frames. Thomas, who had spent 8 months slowly absorbing the rhythms of Valrathi humor, dry, oblique, delivered with a straight face that made it nearly indistinguishable from genuine irritation, until you learned to read the half-degree tilts of an ear, felt something in his chest unclench slightly. This was, he realized, an argument between a mother and a daughter that happened to be occurring in front of a foreign dignitary and 2 members of a human diplomatic delegation, rather than a tribunal, and the distinction mattered enormously. For what it's worth, he offered, on my world, when people elope, the worst that typically happens is an uncomfortable phone call, and maybe someone's mother doesn't speak to them for a holiday season. I want to formally apologize on behalf of my species for not having a protocol robust enough to prepare me for the Valrathi version of this conversation. Your species, the Queen said, has phones that make calls uncomfortable. Ours have councils that can, in theory, dissolve a marriage by unanimous vote if it's deemed to threaten succession stability. I am explaining this not to threaten you, Thomas, but because I suspect my daughter, in her enthusiasm for dramatic efficiency, did not walk you through the actual mechanism she has just disarmed. Thomas blinked. There's a council that can dissolve marriages. There's a council that can theoretically dissolve almost anything, Mila said, with the breezy unconcern of someone describing a minor bureaucratic quirk rather than what sounded, to Thomas, like a genuinely alarming amount of institutional power. It hasn't actually exercised that particular function in something like 200 years. It's mostly ceremonial at this point, like your appendix. My appendix doesn't have the legal authority to end my marriage. No, but if it goes wrong, it can still ruin your whole week, so I feel the comparison holds. Captain Reyes, near the door, made a small sound that he attempted to disguise as a cough, and largely failed at. The Queen's gaze flicked toward him, not unkindly, and something almost like the ghost of amusement crossed her face before she visibly reeled it back in, the way a person tightens a sail before it can catch too much wind. The point my daughter is making, however cavalierly, the Queen continued, is that a council vote requires deliberation, and deliberation requires time. And time is precisely the resource a private announcement would have afforded her opponents on that council to organize, while a public one in front of 400 witnesses, several of them foreign trade ministers whose own governments would take considerable interest in seeing a treaty partner's marriage publicly unmade, removes that option rather neatly. It was, I will admit, a sound piece of strategic thinking. I object entirely to the execution. I have several opinions about the execution that I intend to keep having for some time. That's fair, Thomas said. It is more than fair, it is generous, the Queen said. And I want it noted that I am choosing to be generous, rather than required to be, which is a distinction I expect both of you to appreciate considerably more than you currently appear to. Mila reached over without looking and took Thomas's hand, an easy, unself-conscious motion that suggested, more than any speech could have, exactly how long this had actually been building, and said mildly to her mother, "We appreciate it enormously. Possibly even more once the canapés make their way back into the building." The canapés, as it turned out, survived the ordeal considerably better than Aldrich's nerves. By the time the Queen led the small, battered procession back through the side archway into the main hall, the temperature-sensitive trays had been redistributed across 17 separate serving stations, with what Thomas could only assume was military precision, and the steward stood beside the largest of them, with the haunted, twitchy alertness of a man who had personally negotiated a ceasefire with a tray of seafood. The 400 dignitaries had not, of course, gone anywhere. They had simply rearranged themselves into smaller conversational clusters, the way water finds new channels around an obstacle, and the volume of the room had shifted from the formal hush of ceremony into the lower, busier murmur of several hundred people very enthusiastically discussing what they had just witnessed while pretending, with varying degrees of success, to discuss the trade negotiations they were ostensibly there for. "They're all talking about us," Thomas murmured to Mila as they crossed the threshold. "They were always going to be talking about us. I simply selected the topic and the timing rather than leaving it to chance." She said this with the serene satisfaction of a woman who had engineered a small, controlled avalanche, and was pleased to report that the avalanche had gone exactly where she'd aimed it. "Better they talk about a marriage I chose to announce than spend the next 3 years speculating in corners about a marriage I was trying to hide. Hidden things accumulate interest, Thomas, like debt." "You learned that from the trade ministers." "I learned that from watching the trade ministers very closely for 8 years. There's a difference, and the difference is called due diligence." The Queen, several steps ahead, had already begun the work of re-establishing the evening's choreography, speaking briefly with Aldrich, who nodded with the particular relief of a man being handed back his procedure cards, and the receiving line, somewhat creatively reconstituted, somewhat shorter, considerably more interested in its remaining business than it had been an hour ago, resumed its slow, formal river toward the dignitaries still waiting near the entrance arch. Thomas understood, watching it, that this was the Queen's own piece of strategic theater, every bit as deliberate as her daughter's. The evening would continue, the gala would proceed, and by simply allowing it to proceed rather than collapsing it into crisis, she was telling 400 witnesses, without saying a single word, that the throne considered the matter settled. He found himself standing near the long window again, the one that looked out over the lower terraces, and became aware of a presence at his elbow that turned out to be Aldrich, holding 2 glasses of something pale gold and faintly luminescent. The bioluminescent wine Velreth Prime was apparently famous for in 3-star systems, and that Thomas had learned, the hard way, during his 2nd week on the planet, to drink slowly. "You survived," Aldrich said, handing him a glass with the weary solidarity of 2 men who had both, in their own ways, nearly lost their composure to the same evening. "I want to say, for what it's worth, that I have coordinated court functions for 11 years, and I did not have a contingency card for this. I am having several made. I intend to file them under unforeseen marital disclosures, Royal, and I will be very disappointed in the rest of my career if I never get to use them again. I'm sorry about the canapés." "The canapés," Aldrich said, with the air of a man delivering a eulogy, "have recovered. We do not speak of the canapés again." He paused, glanced sideways at Thomas with something that might have been the beginning of an actual smile. "She is difficult to manage, the princess. I say this with the deepest respect and also 11 years of professional scar tissue. You have my sympathies and my congratulations, in roughly equal measure, possibly slightly more of the former." Thomas laughed properly, for what felt like the first time all evening, the sound surprising him with how easily it came after everything that had preceded it, and he thought, watching Aldrich drift back toward his trays with the air of a man returning to a battlefield he at least understood the terrain of, that there was something almost funny about how much of this, the panic, the protocol, the careful management of appearances, mirrored exactly what would have happened on Earth, in some city hall with some bewildered wedding coordinator, if he'd married anyone at all, anywhere, under any flag. Mila found him there a few minutes later, 2 glasses in, the green moon climbing higher over the terraces outside, and leaned against the window frame beside him with the loose, unguarded posture she only ever seemed to allow herself with him, the public stillness dropping away like a coat shrugged off at the end of a long day. "You went somewhere else in your head again," she said. "Ray's is right, you know, you do that. Your face stays and the rest of you goes on a small trip." "I was thinking about how my mother is going to react when she finds out, eventually, 3 steps removed and several months late, that I got married on an alien planet to an actual princess, and the way she heard about it was second-hand from my sister, who heard it from a coworker, who saw something about it on an off-world news aggregator." "Is that likely?" "Extremely. My family communicates almost exclusively through chains of second-hand information that have degraded by the time they reach me. It's a system. It mostly works. You should call her properly, before the aggregators get there first." Mila considered her glass for a moment, the luminescent wine catching faint light along the curve of it, and added, with the particular gentleness she reserved for the moments when she let her guard all the way down, "I am sorry, by the way. Genuinely. Not for the marriage, I would do that again, exactly the same way today, tomorrow, any day you asked me to, but for the part where I made you stand in front of 400 people, and find out you were already married in the worst possible way to find out you were already married." "I already knew I was married," Thomas said. "I think I was just waiting to see what you'd do with that information. And for the record, terrifying as it was, watching your mother's ear do that little drop thing, I wouldn't have wanted to do it the careful, quiet, diplomatically cleared way. I think I would have hated the version where we asked for permission and waited in some anteroom for a council to deliberate about whether my appendix gets to keep existing." "That's a confusing metaphor, and I love that you've adopted it as your own already. I'm fully Velrathi now. Give it a few months, I'll start growing the ears. I would actually love to see you try." Across the hall, Queen Vivian stood in conversation with the Tessari ambassador, composed and unreadable in the way she had clearly spent decades perfecting, but as her gaze drifted, briefly, toward the window where her daughter stood with her very new, very human, very unauthorized husband, something in her expression eased just slightly, the practiced stillness softening at its edges the way ice softens at the first warm hour of a long thaw, not melting, not yet, but no longer entirely frozen either. She did not smile. Thomas understood by now that she might never quite smile, not in any way a human would immediately recognize as one, but her left ear did not drop. It stayed level, attentive, almost at rest, and Thomas, who 8 months ago had arrived on this planet knowing nothing about cloudial migration or bioluminescent wine or the precise grammar of Velrathi formality, who had spent a quiet evening at a registry office in Lower Havana because the alternative felt unbearably distant, and the timing, as Mila had said, had simply never seemed worth waiting for, found that he recognized that small, steady stillness now without needing it translated. It was, he understood, as close to a blessing as the moment required, and it was, standing there with a glass of impossible wine and a wife who had once detonated 400 years of protocol in a single sentence because she'd known exactly what she was doing. More than enough.